childbirth has been happening for approximately 300,000 years longer than hospitals have existed. And, that is really worth sitting with. The human species became the human species, spread across every single continent, built the first civilizations, invented writing, mathematics, philosophy, and the wheel, all before anyone developed the concept of a dedicated medical facility where births could be managed under clinical conditions.
Every person who ever lived before the 19th century was born without a hospital. And every person who ever lived before the 20th century was born without the specific combination of antiseptic technique, trained obstetric care, and emergency surgical capability that characterizes modern hospital birth. And yet, the species survived. Actually, more than survived. It grew, expanded, and thrived to the point of producing 8 billion people. Which really suggests that the pre-hospital birth system was working well enough to sustain population growth across the entire span of human prehistory and history until very, very recently. So the question is, how? Well, the answer involves female knowledge networks, specific birth positions with massive biomechanical advantages, surprisingly sophisticated herbal pharmacology, and a role that existed in virtually every human culture called the midwife. Let's go through it properly.
First, we need to look at biology's greatest evolutionary conflict. Because understanding why human childbirth is as challenging as it is, well, that provides essential context for everything that follows. See, human birth is, by the standards of the mammalian world, extraordinarily difficult. Most mammals give birth with relatively little difficulty. The newborn passes through the birth canal head first, the canal is wide enough relative to the infant's head to allow a fairly smooth passage, and the process is typically rapid. Complications definitely exist, but they're relatively uncommon. But for us humans, birth is complicated by 2 evolutionary developments that are individually spectacular adaptations, but they are in direct, dangerous conflict with each other. The first is bipedalism. Walking upright on 2 legs required a restructured pelvis. It became narrower, more bowl-shaped, with a birth canal that's significantly smaller relative to our body size than in quadrupedal mammals. The second development is encephalization. Basically, the human brain is enormous relative to our body size, and the skull that contains it is correspondingly large. So you have a large-brained infant that absolutely must pass through a narrow pelvis. The result? A birth process that is mechanically challenging in ways that literally have no parallel in our closest primate relatives. To make matters even more complicated, human newborns are born at an earlier developmental stage relative to other primates. Think about it. The brain, which is already huge at birth, would be significantly larger if gestation continued long enough for the same degree of development we see in newborn chimpanzees. If we waited that long, birth would be literally impossible. So the newborn human is born in a state of profound helplessness. The consequence of this evolutionary compromise is that human birth is an event that can go wrong in ways that the birth of most other mammals simply cannot. A chimpanzee giving birth alone in a tree is doing something that works reliably in the vast majority of cases. But a human giving birth alone, without assistance, that faces a significantly higher rate of complications that, without intervention, would be fatal. And that brings us to the ancient midwifery solution. Because of this severe biomechanical reality, every human culture that has ever been documented developed a specific, life-saving social architecture around childbirth. That institution is, in its most basic form, the midwifery tradition. And this is older than civilization itself. It's older than agriculture. The word midwife actually comes from Old English, literally meaning with woman. It's a dedicated role meant to bring experienced people together around the birthing woman to provide assistance, support, and management for those very specific mechanical and physiological challenges we just talked about. And we know for a fact this wasn't just primitive guesswork. Long before modern science, ancient civilizations were already systematically recording empirical wisdom. Way back in 1550 BCE, the Egyptian Ebers papyrus was already codifying procedures for difficult births. Over in ancient Greece, the Hippocratic corpus detailed birth processes. And by the 2nd century CE, the Roman physician Cyrannus of Ephesus wrote a comprehensive obstetric textbook that was used for centuries. They were actively codifying knowledge that had already existed in oral and practical form for generations. Now, let's dive into the fascinating world of ancient biomechanics and herbal medicine, because what's really interesting here is how some of these traditional methods compare to modern medicine. Believe it or not, ancient practices actually beat out modern hospital defaults in pure biomechanical efficiency. The modern default, the lithotomy position, where a woman lies flat on her back, was adopted in the 17th and 18th centuries largely for physician convenience and visual access. Biomechanically speaking, it's highly disadvantageous. It completely works against gravity, compresses the sacrum, and reduces the power of the diaphragm. In stark contrast, ancient traditions utilized upright, kneeling, or squatting positions. These actually work with gravity. They allow the sacrum to flex backward to open up the pelvic outlet. And guess what? Contemporary obstetrics research confirms these ancient positions result in shorter labors and fewer complications.
To put this into perspective, by utilizing a full squatting position, which, by the way, we see in birth imagery from ancient Egypt all the way to the pre-Columbian Americas, ancient women increased the diameter of their pelvic outlet by up to 30% compared to lying flat. 30%! That is a massive biomechanical advantage that translates directly into an easier passage for the infant's head.
Now, we often assume ancient women just suffered silently, but pain during labor is not a fixed, immutable experience. Traditional birth practices actively managed pain. They used freedom of movement, warm water immersion, familiar company to reduce fear and anxiety, and even rhythmic vocalization. All of these things actively modify the neurophysiology of pain perception. On top of that, midwives utilized a highly sophisticated herbal pharmacology that absolutely rivaled early modern medicine. For example, willow bark was used, which is the original source of salicylates, the exact same compound class as modern aspirin. They used ergo, a fungus on rye, for centuries to stimulate contractions. Modern medicine eventually isolated those exact active compounds to create synthetic oxytocin. They also used blue and black cohosh for hormone modulation, raspberry leaf to soothe uterine smooth muscle, and shepherd's purse for its vasoconstrictive properties to manage life-threatening postpartum hemorrhage. So this wasn't superstition, folks. This was highly applied pharmacology. But it wasn't just about physical positions and herbs. Let's look at the social architecture of ancient birth. You see, ancient birth was almost never a solitary experience. It was an exclusively female-led space meticulously designed to serve 4 key functions. First, practical assistance to physically support the mother. Second, absolutely crucial emotional support to reduce fear. Third, and perhaps most importantly for human survival overall, apprenticeship. Medical knowledge that isn't written down can be lost in a single generation. By including less experienced women as assistants, this space acted as a robust transmission mechanism. It ensured life-saving empirical knowledge survived across millennia without textbooks. And finally, ritual embedding provided a narrative framework to help process such a demanding physical event. Now, let's look at the reality of medical progress. Because to truly understand this explainer, we have to look at the historical data without romanticizing the past. Despite their incredible empirical knowledge, ancient birth was undeniably dangerous. Historically, around 1 to 2% of individual births resulted in maternal death. But when you calculate that across a woman's reproductive career of, say, 5 or 6 pregnancies, it results in a pretty sobering statistic, a cumulative 5 to 10% risk of dying. It was a very real, very significant risk. But this actually highlights the true nature of medical progress. Traditional midwifery wasn't some kind of primitive ignorance. It was empirical medicine that successfully reduced birth mortality to the absolute lowest level achievable without surgery or germ theory. Modern obstetrics didn't replace a bad system. Instead, it took that incredibly solid empirical foundation and simply added surgical capability, antiseptic technique, and pharmaceutical precision. And thanks to those specific modern medical additions, maternal mortality in high-resource settings has plummeted to around 0.01%. That is an absolute miracle of human progress. We are talking about a reduction by roughly 2 whole orders of magnitude. So the crucial takeaway here is this. The hospital is a very, very recent addition to a project that is 300,000 years old. Modern obstetrics, at its absolute best, is simply the continuation of a deeply human project of survival and care, bringing human intelligence to bear on the exact moment a new person enters the world. Today, we're actually seeing modern hospitals integrate ancient practices like upright birthing, continuous labor support, and non-pharmacological pain management right back into the delivery room. So as we return to these ancient biomechanic and support systems, we're left with a fascinating question. What other traditional, empirical knowledge have we dismissed too quickly?